Welcome to We Can Be. I'm Chris DeCardy. Today's guest leads one of the nation's top voting advocacy organizations, and her work is especially important at this moment in time. Lauren Kunis is CEO and Executive Director of VoteRiders, a nonpartisan nonprofit organization with a mission to ensure that all citizens can exercise their freedom to vote. Lauren brings extensive experience to her role at the Santa Monica, California-based VoteRiders, including time with the World Bank, where she worked on democracy and governance programs in more than 15 countries. She also served as National Program Director at Nonprofit Vote, where she led her team to a record-setting number of voter registrations on Voter Registration Day in 2020. VoteRiders has team member or partner organization leads in 44 states and an army of over 10,000 volunteers spread across the country. With an increasing number of states enacting restrictive registration and voting laws, VoteRiders' work is indispensable for strengthening our democracy today.
You have your voter card, but do you have your ID?
Well, Ohio is one of 12 states that passed laws stiffening their in-person voter identification law.
The Minnesota Senate has made voter photo ID a priority.
Mandate a photo ID.
Right now on Fox 43 News at 5, state lawmakers have introduced a new proposal to change voter ID requirements in Pennsylvania.
It's particularly timely to have this conversation. We're in the middle of an election. I am fascinated to know why VoteRiders exists and why you decided, in a career that is touched on improving democracy and democratic systems, you've decided that this is the place to be.
So VoteRiders is a national voting rights organization focused on the increasingly crucial issue of voter ID because of the onslaught of voter ID laws that we've seen sweep the country, particularly since the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, but also since 2020. We're now at a point where 38 states in the country have voter ID laws in place. This is more than ever before in our country's history, and there are actually 18 states that have passed new or stricter ID laws since 2020 alone as a result of lies about election integrity coming out of 2020. So at VoteRiders, we focus on voter education around the issue of ID, making sure that every eligible voter knows what they need to bring to the polls, knows what ID they need to vote by mail, or knows that they don't need to bring anything to the polls, and that's okay too. And we also provide one-on-one ID assistance to any eligible voter who needs it to cast a ballot, covering all transportation and legal and document costs to make sure they have the ID that they need to cast a ballot. Our work is very unique in that it centers civic engagement and voting access, but because of our focus on ID, it also touches on economic justice and opportunity and social justice and racial equity. For so many of the thousands of voters that we help get ID every single day, that ID helps them vote, but it's also a way for them to open a bank account for the first time, or get a job in the formal sector, or get more stable housing for their family. So it's really personally and professionally satisfying to see the work that we do every day touch on so many of the things that I care about so deeply.
Do you need ID to vote? It's confusing. Each state has different rules. Find out what you need. Go to voteriders.org and vote with confidence, knowing you can't be turned away.
What is the history in our democracy around fraud in elections? What do we know about voting fraud and its prevalence?
So what we know about fraud in our elections is that it does not exist. That is the number one core message. And one of the reasons for which voter ID laws are so problematic is because they're almost a solution in search of a non-existent problem. Every voter, when they register to vote, confirms that they are a citizen, that they are eligible. And voter ID laws are there to hypothetically prevent in-person fraud at the polls. Study after study, year after year, has shown that that type of fraud is non-existent. And what we see, unfortunately, is this legislative solution to prevent a problem that doesn't exist actually causes massive problems across the country for eligible voters that prevents them from exercising their freedom to vote. We know that voter ID laws directly disenfranchise tens of millions of voters who don't have the specific form of ID they need to cast a ballot, even though they have the requisite ID to register to vote. They live in a state that has a higher bar for proving your identity at the polls. And voter ID laws also cause massive confusion. Pennsylvania is a great example of that. You know, in Pennsylvania, you have to show an ID at the polls if you're voting for the first time in your precinct, which is super complicated and confusing, and the message gets very muddied. We actually, just a few months ago, worked with the Brennan Center for Justice and the Center for Democracy and Civic Engagement at the University of Maryland to do the first national study on voter ID access in nearly 20 years. And what we found really confirmed what we have known from doing this work for over a decade, which is that millions of voters are directly and indirectly disenfranchised by voter ID laws because of documentary proof requirements, but also confusion.
In a simplified version of the world, there would be an equitable application of whatever requirements there were for voting. But you've just given several examples where that's not the case. Maybe just go into a little bit more detail. Are there particular groups of folks that end up being impacted in this way?
So the research I just mentioned found that 14.5% of voting age citizens didn't have a government-issued photo ID, like a driver's license or a state ID card, that had their current name and address on it. So that's almost 35 million eligible voters in the United States. And young people were far more likely to lack an unexpired current ID than their older peers. We also found that citizens of color were almost 4 times more likely to lack a current unexpired ID. People who identified as having a disability, low-income individuals, groups that are already underrepresented in our electorate writ large are most harmed and most disproportionately impacted by voter ID laws. Our electorate already skews older and whiter and more affluent and more educated than the average American, and voter ID laws make that even worse. They're making it harder to vote when it's more important than ever to vote. So they're really undermining our shared democracy and impacting all voters, not just ones from certain states or certain communities.
So it's pretty extraordinary that 1 in 7 people have this now added barrier to address a problem that has been non-existent. What do we know about the party affiliation question for folks who support voter ID laws?
We did look at that when we did our research, and we found that actually eligible voters who did not identify with any political party were most likely to lack ID. Individuals who were not registered to vote, who did not cast a ballot in the last election, were more likely to lack that form of ID. So it sort of speaks to disenfranchisement and lack of political participation, and there's potentially an interplay there. When we looked at registered Democrats versus registered Republicans, we did find that registered Democrats were slightly more likely to lack ID than Republicans. The question about, partisan drivers of voter ID laws, VoteRiders is a nonpartisan organization, and we are not here to assign motive, or we're not even able to get inside the head of some of the people who are pushing forward this legislation. I will say we saw a lot of lies about election integrity coming out of the 2020 election. And the response that we saw in state house after state house in the post-2020 to today period was the passing of voter suppression laws. And voter ID often found itself at the forefront of that. And at VoteRiders, we feel very strongly this is because the impact of voter ID laws is misunderstood. I think many of us have grown up in this sort of privileged bubble where as soon as we turned 16, we got our driver's license and started driving, and most people in our circles have a form of ID that would work for voting. So I think even among legislators who are trying to expand voting access, they don't necessarily understand the harm that voter ID laws cause. So that's why at VoteRiders, we were really proud to work with the Brennan Center and the University of Maryland on this research so that we had the data to better tell the story of the impact of voter ID laws to hopefully sort of curb the passage of new and stricter ID laws.
I think that's really interesting. The biggest split here is actually between people who have the opportunity to participate in democracy and potentially in our society and those that don't. I'm interested because you mentioned that the voter ID focus that you have has also opened up connection to broader issues around access and about opportunity. What have you found, and what are you connecting to off of this question of voter ID into this broader mission?
Yeah, it's super interesting. I oftentimes refer to ID as sort of our Trojan horse. It's our way to get in the door, to do collaborative work with partner organizations across sectors, across the country that might not be very motivated to do something like voter registration. You know, my job immediately before coming to VoteRiders was running a big national voter registration campaign. And a lot of times in our effort to expand the electorate with equity, to sort of talk to the eligible voters that parties and campaigns were not spending time on, we approached partners like food banks and shelters and community health centers. And we said, we want to register voters on site. And they were kind of like, we wish you well, but voting is not front of mind for the community we are serving. These are marginalized individuals who are trying to get a roof over their head and feed their family, and voter registration, we just don't have bandwidth for that. But when we approach those same type of organizations, as VoteRiders, we can say, we're here to help people get ID for free. And then these same organizations are very interested, in fact. So we can say we're going to help them get the ID they need to transition out of the shelter and get stable housing, or get a job in the formal sector and have, a more stable economic pathway. And the organizations really see the value in that. So it's a really good way for us to sort of deliver a very needed service and use that as a way to open up a conversation to say, and now you can vote. We will help you through the process. We have a trusting relationship, so it doesn't feel transactional. So it's a really nice way to engage eligible voters who are checked out of the system.
So dive deeper. Give us an example. Is there a favorite community partnership you can lift up and talk about in more detail in this way?
Absolutely. Thinking about our work in Allegheny County, we work with the local YMCA. We've done work in the county jail. We work with local libraries and low-income housing organizations to help people connect the dots between services that they need, their broader goals, and also being able to have a say on those very same issues at the ballot box. We also do a lot of work in Pennsylvania in particular with high schools and on college campuses because of that unique requirement of ID is needed for first-time voters in their precinct. But really, all across the country, we have partnerships with a Waffle House in Georgia. People come to them looking for a job and they can't get a job there without an ID. So we have our organizers swoop in and help them get the ID they need to secure employment, but then also register and cast a ballot in a strict photo ID state like Georgia. We always center young people in our outreach, but with our research knowing even more about how uniquely harmed young people are, we're trying to do even more on campuses and also in sort of, with community organizations that serve youth, recognizing that not every young person is at college or university.
Is there something unique about Pennsylvania? I think this time of year, all we hear about in Pennsylvania that is unique is that it is a swing state and political campaigns come through and over-focus advertisement campaign stops. But is there anything from your perspective about what exists in Pennsylvania, a history or the way the voter ID law is set up that is unique to what you're doing across the country?
It's not just because my family lives in Philly that I will say that Pennsylvania is the center of the political universe. All eyes are on Pennsylvania along with a few other states. I would say what's unique about Pennsylvania when it comes to voter ID is the show ID for the first time in your precinct. What we often see is well-intentioned partners or election officials putting out the message that you don't need ID. Because for many voters, if you're going back to the same polling station that you have voted at for the last 20 years, you do not need to bring ID. But what we miss in that message is getting the right information out to the people who do need to bring ID. And I'm particularly concerned about that gap, because all of the research shows that if you vote early, if you vote the first time you're eligible to vote, if it becomes part of your identity, if it becomes a habit, you're more likely to be a lifelong voter. And conversely, if you're an 18-year-old who's really excited to go to the polls and you go and you're turned away because you didn't bring the ID that no one told you needed to bring, that can be a really disappointing experience, and it can turn you off to voting. We just want to make sure that everyone feels confident and empowered in casting a ballot and has the information they need. And we are very cognizant of the fact that we do sort of on the margins could be a difference maker. Our impact is magnified in states like Pennsylvania, where margins historically and likely into the future are going to be so very tight. Every ballot counts everywhere, but particularly in Pennsylvania, we are doing everything we can to make sure we have the impact we want to.
So talk a little bit about what that looks like, because I think the majority of folks have the experience that I've had, which is I moved to a new state. I'm a relatively recent transplant to Pennsylvania, and I went to the DMV, had to get the car registered, got my driver's license, and have the opportunity to register to vote. And there had been a big push over the years for motor voter laws to allow that to happen. But for folks that you're working with, is it the avenue that you're still essentially going into the DMV, or what are the other mechanisms?
It depends on the person. It depends on the state, of course. But when we do site-based work at a food bank or shelter or a farmer's market, at a college new student welcome fair, we start by sharing information on voter ID and making sure that people are educated on the intricacies of their state's voter ID law. So even if they are one of those 1 in 7 that doesn't have a current government-issued photo ID with their current name and address on it, there are ways for them to still cast a ballot. For people who do not have the form of ID that they need, we take a lot of pride in being there every single step of the way. A lot of times we sit with them at one of these community events and order a certified copy of their birth certificate online, and we cover those costs. We, in some states where we work, have standing appointments at the DMV or at PennDOT, if we're switching to Pennsylvania lingo. We have a partnership with Lyft this year where we offer free transportation to eligible voters to and from ID issuing offices. Sometimes our staff and volunteers even go so far as to meet people at the DMV or other ID issuing office to make sure that they have sort of a buddy to navigate uncomfortable bureaucracy and have an advocate, particularly if you're not used to interacting with government bureaucracy, or if English is not your first language, or for if you have a disability, or for a whole host of reasons. We pay for the license or state ID card that people need. So we really sort of do everything we can to make sure that the legal and logistical and transportation and financial barriers that get in the way of many of our fellow citizens and community members being able to get the ID they need to vote are removed. We work with thousands of volunteers and historically have worked with almost 2,000 partner organizations to make sure that our voter ID tools and services are incorporated into what they're offering to their communities. If you go to our website and see the stories of the people that we assist, they can be really informative and illustrative in sort of showcasing the different types of barriers that many different people face.
The largest Latin American civil rights organization is calling for a federal investigation into a series of raids conducted by the Texas Attorney General's office to combat voter fraud. AG Ken Paxton's office says these undercover operations are happening in response to reports that some organizations in Texas may be unlawfully registering non-citizens to vote or engaging in ballot harvesting. But the League of United Latin American Citizens, or LULAC, is denouncing the raid as, quote, point-blank voter intimidation.
Has there been blowback to what you are doing? And I say that because I saw a story in Texas. I wonder if you see in particular places the work that you're doing. Do you find that folks are actually trying to keep that from happening in any kind of way?
We do. It's a tough environment to be doing this work in. And I think, as someone who is a democratic activist to my core, it really pains me to see this. It's a really sad development for our country that nonpartisan activities like voter registration, like educating voters about ID laws in their state and helping eligible citizens vote has become politicized, and it has become viewed through a partisan lens. A little less so in Pennsylvania and then some of the other states where we're working, like Florida and Texas and Arizona, where we try to do things like attend a community resource fair and are told by organizers that they don't want to do anything political and they don't want to do anything partisan, which we are not. And, I will really sort of reject the premise of that assertion until I have no breath left. I feel very strongly that our work to expand voting access to eligible citizens in service of a more representative electorate and democracy, that is patriotic, that is not partisan. We cannot validate this idea that nonpartisan voter education and voter engagement work is anything but something that all Americans of all affiliations should be able to get behind.
Yeah, and I think particularly going back to your research, that it is people who have not voted, people who haven't had access to vote, that is the primary driver on this. But I think it raises an important point that you touched on in the very beginning of our conversation, and we should spend a little time on. You mentioned the Voting Rights Act and the rollback of the Voting Rights Act. The ID, the need to produce an ID, carries with it connection to efforts in the past to be able to prevent people from exercising a franchise that had been given to them. I'm also interested because a lot of folks have a history with government systems that they don't believe they've been treated fairly. Is there anything in your research where people actually are concerned that they're presenting an ID in a way that might make them a target around particular precincts with ballots and challenges of those ballots, and folks that may see that they may be drawn into that? Is there anything that from your research raises that as a concern, or are those more isolated stories that we've heard through elections?
So our research didn't ask about voter intimidation at the polls, but it did measure voters' knowledge of ID laws in their state. And if you're not armed with that knowledge, you're more likely to be a target for intimidation. So we found that 55% of voters who live in a strict photo ID state didn't know or weren't sure they would need to bring that form of ID to the polls. And we also saw the flip, people who lived in non-voter ID states mistakenly thinking that they would need to bring ID to the polls. So that sort of speaks to people who sort of self-disenfranchise because they live in a state like New York where you don't need to bring ID, but they think they do, so they stay home on election day. While it wasn't covered in our research, I will say anecdotally, we absolutely see voter ID laws being weaponized for intimidating voters at the polls. There have been studies not done by VoteRiders that show that people of color or young people are more likely to be asked to show ID at the polls when the law does not require that. We see instances in states like Texas and Florida where the anti-trans rhetoric is at a fever pitch right now, where, the law doesn't require your gender identity to align with your ID, but poll workers are sort of taking it into their own hands. And we hear lots of reports of harassment and intimidation at the polls. And of course, the more sort of marginalized individuals in our society are more likely to be subject to that form of intimidation. Another community that we're watching quite closely and trying to do everything we can to support is new citizens. The fever pitch around non-citizens are voting in federal elections is at an all-time high, and it is complete nonsense and not backed up by any facts or reality. But, it could be the case that someone like in a state like Pennsylvania gets a driver's license as a non-citizen, then they naturalize and they go to the polls and they still have an ID that may indicate that they are not a citizen. So we're making sure that everyone who is a newly naturalized citizen knows that they need to update their ID so that they're not subject to this discrimination that aligns with the sort of false rhetoric that non-citizens are voting and therefore there is electoral fraud.
So it's a good transition to where do you see this issue going? So I think first, just outline where are we in the United States? Where are some of the most stark examples of voter ID and related laws put in place that you see right now?
I would encourage everyone to go to our website, and we have an interactive map for all 50 states and DC that shows the ID laws in your state for voting in person and voting by mail. So the strictest states are ones like Georgia that are a strict photo ID state, where there are a limited number of photo ID options that you can present at the polls. And if you don't have one of those, you have to take extra steps for your ballot to count. At the other end of the voter ID law spectrum, if you will, are non-strict, non-photo voter ID states. So these are states where you can present non-photo options, like this is the case in Pennsylvania, such as a utility bill or a bank statement, that are accepted for ID purposes, and where also, if you don't have a specific form of ID that you need, you can sign an affidavit and still cast a regular ballot. This is the case, for example, in Michigan and Virginia. If you have an ID, you should bring it, but if you don't, you can cast a regular ballot anyways, and you don't need to take extra steps to cure your ballot. You know, Ohio is another example of a state that passed a new and much stricter ID law just in the last year. And we're doing a lot of work on the ground to sort of fight back against the disenfranchising effect of that, but also the misinformation and confusion around it.
And where is this going? So there's no evidence of any significant voter fraud that in any way is tipping elections. What is happening on the education you and others are doing into policymakers so they can better understand what policies actually work or don't work? And do you see a direction where this is headed if you look in the next decade looking forward?
There are a few trends that we are watching closely and doing everything we can to sort of mitigate the impact. You know, I do think voter ID laws are not going away. They are here to stay, or they're not going away anytime soon, at the very least. There are a few worrying trends that we've seen in the last few years that we worry will continue. One is the addition of stricter ID requirements for mail-in voting, tying to this false idea that mail-in votes were the linchpin of the fraudulent 2020 election. I hate even giving oxygen to that because it's such like baloney. But in a number of states, we have seen the disconcerting trend of striking student ID as a form of accepted ID at the polls. You know, and to me, that's troubling because it just sends a clear message like, who are we inviting into the process and who are we trying to shut out? I think voter ID laws can be weaponized to sort of demographically gerrymander the electorate and say, a gun permit is okay, gun owners come vote in droves, but students, your student ID does not work at the polls. And at the end of the day, federal legislation is the solution. You know, if we had sort of federal legislation that set forth minimum national standards when it comes to all things voting, and especially voter ID, that would be our best and sort of easiest guardrail against states that are imposing new and stricter ID laws and other forms of voter suppression.
At the Heinz Endowments, we care broadly about civic engagement. We believe that our democracy is only as strong as the capacity for people to have their voices heard, and we're proud to support you all and many others in the near term and in the longer term on this. In each of our podcasts, we have a guest questioner, and our guest questioner today has a question for you along these lines.
Hi, Lauren. Matt Barron here. I'm a program director at the Heinz Endowments, where a good portion of my work focuses on our democracy grant making. You know, I'm a big fan of your work and of VoteRiders. Thank you for what you do to help level the voting access playing field. In addition to nonprofit organizations like VoteRiders, there are a number of different sectors that are working on voting access issues. State and local government, student organizations, individuals, people from across the spectrum. But my question to you involves funders and philanthropy. What advice do you have for grant makers who want to move the needle on improving voting access for all, and for organizations who want to approach funders about their democracy work?
Great question. Always good ones from Matt. I think philanthropy has a really powerful and important role to play in supporting voting access. Nonprofit organizations like VoteRiders, we are fortunate to receive funds from institutional funders and a growing but limited number of companies and brands, as well as individual supporters at all different giving levels. A perennial truth that organizations like ours encounter is that interest and support spikes in big presidential election years and then really diminishes in so-called off years. But expanding the electorate with equity and building pathways for civic engagement is work that goes on every single day of every single year. And so I think philanthropy can play a really important role in helping organizations like ours always be on and sort of in providing steady support year in and year out for us to do this important work. I also think philanthropy has a really powerful role to play in being a convener, in sort of connecting organizations doing similar and aligned work in this space to make sure that we are supporting each other and that the sum of the whole is greater than the individual parts so that our overall impact is even greater.
Your enthusiasm for this work has come through over this past hour, and I am grateful for the time you've shared today. I think my last question before we wrap up is, where did that passion come from and why? Why is this your calling?
My mom was a public school teacher and my dad was a doctor. And I remember standing in the school parking lot with my mom right outside the line of the polling station, encouraging people to vote in support of passing the school budget. So I feel like I was raised in a very political household, but particularly from an issues perspective. But really, some of the things that inspire me doing this work in this moment in the United States are drawn from my experience in supporting democratic activists in really unlikely and challenging places like Syria and Iraq and all over the Middle East and sub-Saharan Africa, and just sort of the universal, I think, human desire for freedom and a voice in the systems that govern you is what sort of keeps me going. And also, I would say, I have 2 young kids, and I'm often thinking about the fact that the sort of democracy and country and climate we leave them is the most important work that we can do. So happy to be playing my small part in that important work.
The name of our podcast is We Can Be. As you think about our democracy, what do you believe it can be?
It can be a bigger tent. I think it can be a more powerful force for good and for everyone.
Well, at the Heinz Endowments, we draw our inspiration from organizations like yours, leaders like you, trying to make a difference in the world every day. Thank you for being with us.